Hello and welcome to Let's Talk About EX. Today's guest is Matt McFarlane, a startup compensation specialist who's on a mission to help fast-growing companies stop winging it when it comes to pay. Matt's the founder of FNDN, a brilliant newsletter called the FNDN Series, and the creator of the upcoming Startup People Summit. He's worked in-house in people ops, he's consulted across the startup ecosystem, and he now helps scale-ups build pay practices that are clear, fair, and competitive. We dive in this conversation to the rise of pay transparency, how comp ties into culture, and what every head of people really needs to get right early. Plus, we get a behind the scenes look at what Matt is building next. All right, let's jump into it. Matt, how you going?
Doing great, mate. How are you?
I'm doing just well. Delighted to have you on here, mate. I've wanted to ask you to be on for a while, because I've been a long time follower of your posts and what you do. But for our listeners, I hope hopefully you can share a little bit about your background and why comp strategies become your thing.
Yeah, straight into it. It was a bit of an interesting sort of transition for me. So my background is really like generalist people operations. So I've kind of dabbled in and out of being responsible for talent acquisition as part of that. But yeah, I guess my entire career when I've worked within companies has been people ops, which, I kind of characterize as everything from onboarding through to offboarding, that kind of employee life cycle, compensation, leadership development, engagement, all those bits and pieces. How do we make it all fit together? How do we make it run sort of seamlessly? I've always, enjoyed compensation. I've always been responsible for it in the different companies that I've worked in. And I think when I left my last company and really decided that I wanted to make a go of doing my own thing, I was fairly confident and pretty adamant that I didn't want to be a generalist in a sort of traditional consultant sense. I didn't want to be Matt McFarlane consulting. I come and help you with anything related to people. Like I really wanted to have a clear product offering, and I really wanted to use the opportunity to hone in on parts of my experience and the journey that I'd had that I'd really enjoyed and that I could help companies with specifically, rather than sort of being a jack of all trades or all things to all people. And when I was in that moment, I spent a lot of time reflecting on the things that I did enjoy. Spent a lot of time thinking about the things that I thought were needed, and I kind of came to a realization that, compensation had always been this sort of thread woven throughout what I'd done. I like most people, I think I'd seen it done really poorly and probably been the perpetrator of a few really terrible compensation practices in the companies that I worked in. But I'd also had the opportunity to build and experience some really phenomenal ones in just interesting, progressive, complex environments. And it just kind of was something that I just reflected on really fondly. It's a space that I enjoy for a couple of reasons. One is that it's just hugely commercial, right? Like you're dealing with one of the biggest costs for a business, and it's hugely analytical, which I love. I love how tangible it is as part of the people remit in a sort of department that often can be challenged with being a little bit soft and fluffy. And then the other thing is that it's still a deeply human thing, right? Like you're still talking about the thing that affects whether or not people can put food on the table or a roof over their head. Like everyone's got that, there's a lot of themselves wrapped up in what they're paid. So it's this deeply human thing as well. So I really enjoyed that kind of spectrum that it traversed. And then, the real clincher for me though to sort of dive into it as an offering from a like service delivery perspective was that the timing that I decided to make this transition, there were a bunch of different things happening, in the comp world. So one is that pay transparency, and just the evolution of how people thought of pay was changing drastically. I mean, even in Australia, we're seeing year-on-year changes with the Workplace Gender Equality Agency and the different things they're expecting people to do there. Globally, we're seeing a huge shift in pay transparency. The US mandates it in a lot of their states if you're going to advertise for a job. In Europe, there's a huge amount of legislation coming in there. in various other countries, they've invariably got some form of legislative change. But there's also a really big social shift happening as well. Gen Z, if anyone hires anyone that's in that generation, they've got a very different perspective when it comes to pay. You only have to open, I don't have TikTok, but I'll say TikTok because that's where all the videos that I watch come from. On Instagram, I'm one of those boomer people that watches the reposts. And so, they're talking to people in the street, and there's no taboo around it. And it just comes with a very different expectation. They come to their employers and they go, here's what I think I'm worth. Can you tell me what you think I'm worth? Can you justify it? Where have you gotten your numbers from? What's the basis in it? And I think, all of that has kind of created this really interesting environment. I want to even begin to talk about the changes from a technology perspective and an enablement perspective. But this environment has changed so much. And I think it's put a lot of pressure on companies to get really serious about this space. They have to, because they're trying to keep pace with the changing legislative environment. They're trying to keep pace with a workforce that if they're not hiring Gen Z now, they're going to have to soon. They're about to make up a real big chunk of the workforce, and it's just because it's getting that attention, it's causing a lot of people to go, okay, how do we think about pay? We've gone from being that classic sort of cliched, we pay 50th percentile, to actually let's deeply think about what pay means for us and how it can kind of uphold and support the goals we have as a business. How can it reflect our culture? How can it reflect who we are as a company? All of that really intrigued me. And if I don't know what a gap in the market looks like, but that felt like, there's a real lack of awareness or understanding from a subset of, the HR community that I've come from. There's huge change and evolution in it from an external force. That felt just like a great place to jump into. And it was something that I enjoyed. So yeah, that's almost the entire podcast done. I've spent so long saying that, but
You're making this easy for me.
Catalyst.
You're making this really easy for me. I can go off and make a coffee. This is brilliant. No, you're a rare breed, mate. And I think for a few reasons. One is that you actually enjoy this space. I think that makes you rare. You say gap in the market. I think, yeah, big tick. I think secondly, a lot of people shy away from this space is because it's complex for many of the reasons that you've just mentioned, and it's a kind of changing space, and with change sometimes becomes a little bit, or seemingly more, complexity. But it's also an area that requires a lot of tough conversations, which people tend to shy away from as well. You're a rare breed also because you've actually been in the role. I know there's lots of consultancies that set up, or a lot of people that are consulting in this space who've never actually worked as or with heads of people. And you're from that community, you're from that environment. And I know you work a lot with kind of scaling startups and businesses with growth ambitions. What are the key challenges for those heads of people?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the sort of the fundamental problem that I come in to solve is quite consistent for a lot of these sorts of companies, but it stems around they've raised a round of funding, they're trying to go through a stage of growth, they've probably got a loose idea of the kinds of people that they need to hire to be able to hit the goals that they have. Often they don't know how to quantify that skill set, like what specifically is the role. They'll kind of, they'll have a conversation with the various managers or a CTO or something like that. But I think that ability to really, just detail and define the role that they're hiring for can be quite challenging for them. And then where I guess my particular sort of focus comes into play is like, what do we offer? I don't know how many times I've either worked in or interfaced with a company where it's kind of just like whatever the candidate says is the market, and we're going to offer that. And I think there's a lot of savvy people who know how to take advantage of that, but there's also a lot of people who undervalue themselves and miss out on maybe some value and some market aligned salaries as a result of it. But it fundamentally means that a company isn't able to be clear around what that cost is going to look like. They don't know how to benchmark. They want to try to apply some logic, but it definitely isn't scalable and it definitely isn't consistent across the business. And then I think they start to step into some real challenges as they mature as a company because, how do they workforce plan? How do they kind of put a forecast together for what all of these roles are going to cost us as a business? Is it going to consume all of our runway as a company? Are we going to actually be able to hit the goal that we have from a product perspective or for a product company before we run out of cash? Or, what are all these things look like? What if we've hired two people doing the same job at different salaries? We're suddenly, contravening a lot of issues there. Just the list goes on. But I think for me, it's how do I bring kind of clarity, consistency, all of that to companies when it comes to pay? Because either from a commercial perspective as they try to think about what to offer or how to forecast for this sort of cost, or it's the other end of the spectrum where it's like you're just trying to help managers be able to understand how to speak about it. Those are kind of the core issues that I see a lot of the companies that I work with face that I tend to try and help get in and solve.
And what does getting it right actually look like for these businesses?
Yeah, it's funny because I tend to believe that it's more about the sort of less about the numbers rather and more about the rationale. So for me, it's like, companies are really good at kind of coming up with a number. Well, actually, no, they're not really. They come up with a number, let's just say that.
Idea of a number.
I think, an idea of a number. And then I think where they really struggle and where they kind of get themselves caught out is that they struggle to explain the why. So like, how do we be clear around what we're trying to achieve with this pay? So maybe it is a percentile, maybe it's something else that sort of is representative of the organization and what it's trying to achieve. But then the other thing that they really fall over on is the consistency. So often a real big obstacle, for example, for things like pay transparency is that we've got a bunch of people that are being paid inconsistent with what we think maybe they should be. And if we start to share details around what we should be paying people, it suddenly adds to the salary bill. Or, the opposite, we're overpaying people for the roles that we've got because, again, we hired them at a time when we didn't have this structure. And now we have to kind of work out how to answer all of these awkward questions. Timothy and Janine are talking to each other and they do the same job, but they've got different salaries, like how to answer those sorts of questions. They're all the challenges that these companies are facing.
And I imagine with a lot of your clients, you're kind of guiding them through this, and it might be guiding them from practical and sometimes maybe even emotional perspective, as you're kind of taking their hand and asking them to jump into a more transparent kind of way of doing things. What are some of the challenges there, and how do you convince, or how do you work with and encourage leaders to be more transparent and maybe in a proactive way?
Yeah, it's funny because I think a lot of people, again, just based on my my LinkedIn, and I'm obviously just generally my approach to pay transparency is that I'm a real big advocate for it. I think it solves a lot of problems, not just for companies, but for people. So on the whole, I would say, transparency is the right way to go, and it's the right way for us to be moving as a society. But I think where I really caution companies around transparency is that sometimes people see transparency as the destination when actually it's just a step along the path to it's just part of the journey, really. And I think for me, I get companies with aspirations of transparency, but then they can't explain the rationale or the reasoning behind the number. And I think that's the thing that I always just try and help contextualize for people, is that the second you make that number transparent, people are going to come up to you and say, why is that the number? What's the number based on? Where's the data come from? Who are the companies we're comparing ourselves to? How do I make that number grow if I'm in that role? Like, these are all the questions that follow on from transparency. Not to mention that as a company, you like your position around pay transitions from people just trying to find answers to what we pay to now people asking you to defend why we pay what we pay. And so I think for me, there's a whole lot of work that needs to go into building a really solid basis and reasoning around what, how we choose to pay as a company before we go down the path of pay transparency. And this is assuming you're in an environment where you aren't mandated to do that by the government. I mean, I did a lot of stuff with US startups at one point where they were caught really flat-footed by the pay transparency legislation that came in there. And so for those that are unfamiliar, there was a lot of legislation that came into place in places like New York or San Francisco where they had to start publishing a salary range. It could be any salary range, but a salary range on all of their job ads if they were going to hire people from that area. And what ended up happening is that they put a salary range on the job ads, but then all their internal people are going, well, hang on a second, I'm not paid that. Well, what's going on here? So you've kind of got this issue where you've extended a courtesy to candidates, but not that same courtesy to your employees. And so you really have to, just adhering to the legislation isn't always the best answer, because actually you can do that and still cause damage internally if you're not thinking about the impact and the experience for all people and all stakeholders as part of that journey. So yeah, there's really I've written guides on this, I talk about this a lot, but I think there's a lot that it has to go into getting pay transparency right. It's not just flipping the switch and kind of going, yeah, we've achieved it, we've done it, pay transparency tick.
I suppose one of those areas where, there likely is a lot of short-sightedness. When you're working with heads of people, how do you take them, or how do you help them see beyond the here and now? And are there any other kind of frameworks around career or beyond just being transparent and equitable that you use to help people think more medium to long term?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think when I generally the first question I'll ask when people say we want to do pay transparency is why. Again, if you're not required to do it, and in Australia we don't have any requirements to do actual pay transparency, which for me is when an individual is aware of the value that's placed on the role, so either as a candidate or as an employee. So I think answering the question why is first and foremost. I think there's a lot of great reasons why. So one is being compliant with the legislation. Two is culturally, how can it enable you? Is transparency a really strong kind of cultural or a values or a mission part of your business? Is it something that we're doing in adherence with that? And that's been the case for me in a past role. What else was I going to say? Is it something that actually is a bit of a competitive edge for you? As a company, there's are you struggling to find talent, or you're struggling to, find good talent in a particular role? I think in the market at the moment, no one's short of candidate volume, but I think where a lot of people struggle is trying to sort the sort of wheat from the chaff. And there's a lot of data, because pay transparency isn't a new thing. It's been around for a lot of years. I mean, Buffer's one of the most famous examples, and I think it was last year or the year before, they ticked over 10 years of pay transparency, which is crazy, right? As a concept, it's been around for a while. And what that's meant is we've got this really great evidence around what it actually does for companies. And there's so much to be said for the competitive edge it gives businesses, in the sense that there's a really marked number of people, or a percentage of the talent pool, that won't even apply for a role if there's no salary on there. They'll just go, cool, if you aren't prepared to share that nominal bit of information, I'm not prepared to put together an application or have a conversation with you. I at least need to know if we're aligned there before I'll consider. And if you think of the kinds of people that take that position, they're probably not desperate for a role. They've probably got pretty in-demand skill sets. They know they've got leverage in that perspective. So they might be classified as someone who's fairly talented. They might be the people that you're trying to bring in. So yeah, there's a lot of rationales around why you might want to introduce pay transparency as a business. And I think it's just about getting clear on that before taking the position. I don't know that there's any frameworks and things like that. It's really just a clear case of falling in love with the problem that you're trying to solve, and just understanding whether or not pay transparency is actually the solution, or if it's just something that looks glossy and companies want to adopt because of that.
Awesome, excellent, great answer. I was really interested to hear about the Startup People Summit, because I'd seen that you'd put out a few teaser posts starting last month, and it looks like it's something that's shaping up to be pretty exciting. Can you tell us a little bit about the summit, and maybe motivations behind launching it, and also what you hope people take away?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, the real genesis behind it was that to be honest, it was just for me. I kept asking this question. I was like, where do people go to learn about how startups build and scale people functions? What are the events? What are the communities? Where can that happen? And I just kept asking that question, and everyone I kept asking kept saying they didn't know, or they might, think of this kind of one-off event or this small group or something like that. And I think all of that just kind of led me to go, okay, well, I feel like I'm in a position where I can kind of be the change I want to see. I can kind of, I can probably put together a decent list of people that I would want to learn from if I was building or scaling a people function. And, all I can do is come up with a concept and see if they want to get involved. And that was really the basis of it. Literally, it was really a case of like, can I just build it and see if they will come? And I think so far, we're at this stage still really at the start of it. We're still in early bird ticket sales, but for this event that's happening in July, we've got something like 35 plus speakers already, which is crazy. And I mean, these are people that I would have loved to have learned from when I was in-house, and I think present that really cool opportunity for people who are either first time or maybe it's their second, third, fourth rodeo, trying to build a people function for their startup. And I really want it to be this thing that can kind of be a playbook for people that they can come away with and they can go, cool, I know that so-and-so at this startup, just went through a similar journey to me. Here's something that they talked about as a challenge that popped up that they had to deal with. That's something I can now take away, and hopefully implement in my own startup. I really want it to be that practical, no fluff, like, these are people that have been there and done it, and they know how to tackle, well, firstly, they know how to forecast, some of the challenges you're going to face. And then secondly, they know how to overcome them as well. Because it can be a lonely role, right? Like I've been a sort of standalone head of people before. If you don't have a good network, you feel like you're kind of left to your own devices. That can be really challenging. So the more we can learn from others and some of the experiences that they've had, the better. And I think this is just building on a general trend that I'm seeing in the people space towards more kind of, build in public, open sourcing. And there's so much we have to learn from each other. So I'm excited to play a small part in that.
Excellent, amazing. No, it sounds absolutely fantastic, and obviously the people leaders and kind of growth stage companies would get a lot from this. Are there any other people you would recommend coming along other than those who are already in the people space, or is that predominantly who get the most out of this summit?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, I think if you're in any part of a people team at a startup or like a smaller scaling business, definitely it's for you. I think adjacent people there are definitely founders out there who haven't yet made their first head of people hire. I think there's something in it for them. Or if they've got like a head of ops or something like that that's kind of responsible for people at the moment. I think any of those things, any of those sorts of roles would find a lot of value in the sessions that are coming out of this.
Mentioned founders there. I was just curious to learn from your perspective how much empathy is there usually, or how much awareness is there in founders about the people or the big people problems facing startups right now? Do you tend to see there's a high level or a low level of awareness? Maybe I'm leading the witness here with a question like that, but kind of curious.
I was just going to say, I feel like that could be a podcast in and of itself.
Open up a can here, right towards the back end.
Yeah, there's a spectrum, right? There's people who I think have probably not got a lot of an idea, and I just hope that they're the kinds of people that recognize that that's a gap, and so they hire early when it comes to a head of people or a chief people officer. And then there's some that that have come from that space. I think we're increasingly seeing more chief people officers step into more commercial roles like COOs. There's a few in my network. Some of them are my former bosses, which is cool. But I think that transition of people, becoming founders as well and kind of being able to lead with that perspective and that mentality is increasing too. So, it's I would say there's like a perfect sort of ratio. It's just that, there's a real mix of founders that kind of get it and don't. But I think that we're also seeing more founders that maybe haven't kind of come from that background. I think we're increasingly seeing them prioritize heads of people earlier in the hiring space.
Okay, well, problem's still big, but maybe the trend is our friend with that one.
So, yeah.
I asked that question because I've met a lot of kind of startup heads of people in the last 12, 24 months, and there's this real common kind of state that they find themselves in the early stages of their role, and it's typically they arrive and immediately they've got a backlog of fires to put out because the company's held off on hiring someone in that role, and they come in with all the strategic remit, but then the first 2 years is just like trying to swim, like just trying not to sink and try to put out fires. And it's I think it's a big issue for the future, and probably even more of a reason why these startup people summits, or your startup people summit rather, is really important. Because I think there's a low level of awareness and empathy, and just from my observations, I don't know if that's
Yeah.
validated, but there's a low from a lot of founders when it comes to the big people problems, until of course they get bit in the arse by them, and then it becomes a big thing. So these
Yeah.
proactive kind of communities could be really important. And yeah, hats off to you for seeing a gap, jumping on it, and doing and starting something that would have been helpful when you were in
Yeah.
the role.
Yeah. No, I appreciate it. I think actually there's something that I'd add the more that I've sort of thought about it as you've asked the question. I think something I wonder if that has accelerated part of this trend that I mentioned is that we've kind of seen in the last year or two this real rise of fractional, this concept of people having multiple positions at different startups for 1 or 2 or 3 days a week or something like that. I think that's made this kind of support more accessible for founders, where previously they were like, oh, I'm a bit reluctant to bring on someone full time. There kind of now exists this option, and I'm fortunate to count many of these people in my network. But there's now this option where people can come in, at an earlier, more embryonic stage of the company and help tackle some of those emergent people issues before it becomes this huge issue that we have to get a full-time person in to solve. So yeah, I'm increasingly seeing that model adopted more and more, which is cool, because I think it gives it gives startups a way to solve that problem without having to invest the same kind of capital. But B, it's helping, so many people I know create these kind of portfolio careers where they are able to, sort of future-proof themselves a little bit. They kind of got a bit of security, a bit of redundancy in the multi-contract approach, but it means they can help more companies with their expertise as well, which is really cool.
Yeah, and there's a lot of capability and experience now in the people space amongst lots of different startups, and I know that wasn't always the case 5 and 10 years ago, where there was a startup boom, and many people that filled the people role, and a lot of startups maybe were junior or had jumped from junior to leader level, and I know that's been a trend that it seems like the industry's been trying to correct, but there are plenty of people out there, fractional. Being a great example of that, of where people can get great experience and capability without having to fork out an absolute fortune to hire someone.
Yeah, 100%.
All right, excellent, Matt. It's been excellent chatting with you. I've taken notes for myself here on this one, and I'm sure the listeners have got lots to gain from having listened to this. Is there anything you would like to end on? Any information about the People Summit you'd like to share, perhaps, before we take off?
Yeah, for sure. I appreciate it. I mean, look, I'm chronically online, so I'm always on LinkedIn. Obviously, startup compensation is my focus. But yeah, if the Startup People Summit is something you're interested in, definitely either check out my profile or reach out to me, and I can share more details. But my LinkedIn is kind of the hub of all of the various things that I'm involved in life. So best to find me there.
You're chronically on there in a healthy way. Maybe it's chronically healthy.
I don't know if it's
Oxymoronic,
right.
but yeah.
No, I appreciate it.
All right, brilliant, excellent. Well, thanks for joining us, Matt, and yeah, all the best for the Startup People Summit. And yeah, encourage everyone to go over and check Matt McFarlane's profile and everything that he has to say, just on everything, as well as comp strategy and all the great things he's been talking about here today. But yeah, thanks for joining us, Matt. Pleasure.
I appreciate it. Enjoyed it. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Let's Talk About EX. That was Matt McFarlane, the founder of FNDN and the Startup People Summit. Now, if you want to go deeper and learn more about Matt and the work he does, then I suggest you check out his newsletter, the FNDN Series, his upcoming event, the Startup People Summit, or follow him on LinkedIn. He's prolific on there, as he mentions, and yeah, he's good to go and check out. I'm going to include all of this and all the links that you need in the show notes. But while you're here, make sure that you follow Let's Talk About EX on Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts, and do check us out at xona.com. We've got more smart conversations coming your way soon, so check them out shortly, and thanks for listening.